We're extremely lucky and honored this evening to have such an extraordinary group of writers and editors here to discuss Cheever's place in American letters and his life as well. Blake Bailey is the author of Cheever, A Life, and the editor of the Library of America's two-volume edition, John Cheever, Collected Stories and Other Writings, and John Cheever, Complete Novels. He's also the author of A Tragic Honesty, The Life and Work of Richard Yates. Susan Cheever is the author of numerous works of fiction and nonfiction, including American Bloomsbury, My Name is Bill, Note Found in a Bottle, As Good as I Could Be, Home Before Dark, and Treetops. Her work has been nominated for the National Book Critics Circle Award and won the Boston Globe Winship Medal. She's a Guggenheim Fellow, a director of the Corporation of Yaddo, and a member of the Authors Guild. Ms. Cheever teaches at the Bennington Writing Seminars and at the New School. Her most recent book is Desire, Where Sex Meets Addiction. Brett Anthony Johnson is the author of Corpus Christi Stories, which is a 5 under 35 fiction selection of the National Book Awards, and the editor of Naming the World and Other Exercises for the Creative Writer. Corpus Christi Stories received the Southern Review's Annual Short Fiction Award, the Texas Institute of Letters Debut Fiction Award, the Christopher Isherwood Prize, and the James Michener Fellowship. His work appears in such magazines as the Paris Review, the New York Times Magazine, the Oxford American, and Tin House, and in numerous anthologies. A skateboarder for almost 20 years, he's currently the Director of Creative Writing at Harvard. Our moderator this evening is Max Rudin, publisher of Library of America.
Can I chime in on that subject?
Absolutely.
I think one of the things about his work that's so encouraging to a writer is that he got a lot better. In other words, there are early stories that are amazing, but one of the gifts he had was the ability to see what worked and what didn't work and to build on what worked. And there are 100 other stories, of course, that aren't in the Red Book that two of the people on stage have read. And you can see him, there were stories that were extremely political that didn't work at all. There were all kinds of mistakes, and you can see him just those mistakes falling away as he goes forward, and the things that were good being developed.
Yeah.
So he, that was one of the gifts he had, was the ability to learn.
Well, let's stay there. I mean, one of the things the stories do is map out this territory of American suburbia for literature. John Updike, in his obituary for Cheever, said that many people have written about suburbia, but only John Cheever was able to make an archetypal place out of it, a terrain we can recognize within ourselves. Now, you lived in the actual physical terrain, and you're also familiar with the literary terrain, but how would you, and this is a question really for all three of you, how would you describe that place? I mean, it's written about now as if it's, Yoknapatawpha County. That is to say, Cheever was able to imagine, using his suburban experience, a literary place that doesn't exist, but that somehow exists for all of us. So what's your sense of that?
Well, he was able to make it into a metaphor, but I think, we were saying this before we all got up here with these microphones, that suburbia, when he started, was not something anybody wanted to write about. And Malcolm Cowley said to him, don't write about suburbia, that's trivial. You have to go to Europe and write about the great things and see the Colosseum. And instead, as things happened, he ended up in suburbia and wrote about suburbia. But looking back, it's clear that suburbia is an amazing metaphor because no one works there. They only live there. So it's incredibly rich and devious and interesting suburbia because it's only about domestic life. The professional life happens somewhere else. And he used that and made it into an unbelievable metaphor, a better metaphor, I think, in a way than the family, for everything that he wanted to say.
I don't know how much time we have left. Let's talk about the novel just a little bit. I don't know how much...
How about talking about the biography?
Sure.
Can we, I just thought it'd be interesting to shift a little and ask Blake to talk about how you go about writing a biography and how you, it seems to me that, for our family, it's been a tremendous blessing to have this biography, and it was a tremendous blessing to have Blake writing it because nobody really cares, what you wore 30 years ago at some party, but your father's biographer cares, right? So, it was sort of like being psychoanalyzed in the best possible way, and I think it'd be very interesting for me to hear a little about how Blake to what extent he feels he became my father, to what extent you have to. Is it like a marriage? Is it like what's it like writing biography? How do you take this life? And also, your biography doesn't just deal with the life, it also deals, magnificently may I say, with the work. So how do you strike that balance?
First of all, you find a writer whose family is so charming
Oh,
and intelligent in their own right.
No, really.
Okay, I'll try to keep this short. One of the first major interviews that I did for my book, apart from interviews with your mother and with you and Ben and Fred, was with your father's protege of his last years. His name was Max. I don't want there to be any confusion.
No relation.
No relation.
No relation.
And Max told a story that was very disturbing. It was, for my money, it was sort of the inevitable culmination of the whole tragic narrative arc of Cheever's life. But it did not place Cheever in a very, it's completely self-defeating for a biographer, unless you're Kitty Kelly, to set out to demonize your subject. And I adored Cheever's work, and I wanted very much to like the man, and here I am really at the outset confronted with something that struck me as sordid and insurmountably sordid. The reason I tell that story is because then I read the 4,300-plus page single-space type journal. I interviewed about 149 other people. I interviewed and re-interviewed the family. All of Cheever's children love him and revere his memory and see him warts and all. I mean, in the fullest meaning of that phrase. And finally, when it came time to gather all this material, and it was vast, and make sense of it, put it into thematic threads, and connect A with B and C and D and so on, Cheever was, to me, wholly comprehensible, forgivable, and lovable.
I was going to go from there to a question about Faulkner, actually, if we could, because the comeback kid writes this novel, gets on the cover of Newsweek. His daughter Susan is working at Newsweek and has the chance to interview him. It's an interesting novel because it deals with a heroin addict who kills his brother. In some ways, it's the most frank reckoning with the demons that we've been talking about for the last hour. But in other ways, it's very oblique. That is to say, and Cheever was very nervous about it being taken as a confession. In fact, I believe you asked him a question like that, and I hope you'll tell us about that exchange. So, I mean, as a daughter, and then as a biographer, and as a writer, how do you read that book? I mean, is it a great American novel? Is it built on elements of confession, of self-assessment, of self-parody? I mean, what is the connection between everything we've been talking about and this book about this, homicidal drug addict who puts on airs, this New England gas station attendant who goes to cotillions? I mean, there's resonances there with everything that Blake's been talking about. We've all been talking about. How do you read? And as a daughter, especially, I'm wondering, how do you read the book?
Well, I guess I'm the daughter.
Well, you could lead off.
Well, no, I thought it was a miraculous book, and as you said, my father got sober, which was like watching someone be reborn, and he came out of rehab, he came out of Smithers, a different person, and he immediately sat down to try to write this novel about the prison, which he had been trying to write before and unable to write. And you could see him going into that, creative vortex that we all know so well. And he was so excited about this book. I mean, he would read to us, he would grab anybody who would listen. And, the scene where the cardinal comes in the helicopter and Jody escapes, he was just delighted by that. And, read it to anybody who was around. And then I remember at that point, Farragut's name, isn't Farragut behind us? Yeah. Farragut's name was Loomis, and he said to me, "I know what happens. Loomis gets out." And he was just taken by this novel. And I think the novel is sort of the apex of his talent. Of course, we all as children read The Count of Monte Cristo, which has a very interestingly similar plot. So like all great writers, he took from his life, he took from literature, he took from everywhere that served him. But I certainly don't think it's an autobiographical novel.
Oh, right.
I think any of you can field this question. Do you think John Cheever anticipated his private journals would be public after he died?
No, Blake.
I discuss this in the epilogue of my book. He was of many minds on that subject. And he would chide himself, saying that I've been rereading my old journals, and this is despicable narcissism. You know, it's like looking at myself in a mirror. I shouldn't do it. Stop it. And he donated in the 60s a portion of one journal to Brandeis, which had a big manuscript, Cheever manuscript collection at the time. And I went and looked at this, and I compared it with the same section of that journal that I transcribed on my laptop, and he'd rewritten it for the library, for a little academic posterity, right, for the 5 or 6 people who came to look at this fragment of his journal. So it was very important to him to look good to posterity, right? I think toward the end of his life, he looked at it, he thought, wow, I'm becoming famous again. This is a very important document. This is one of the most massive, monumental journals of a first-rank writer that exists. It is a signal contribution to its genre. I kind of owe to and yet I keep referring to my member, my member in this journal. It's kind of unseemly. Toward the end of his life, he told his son Ben that he looked forward to future generations enjoying the journal once he was dead. I think he might have wanted Mary to be dead too, but I don't know. You would perhaps know better than I. What do you think, Susan?
Just exactly what you said. I think as he neared the end of his journey, as he would say, he became more and more aware of the immense literary and personal value of the journals. He actually got extremely paranoid about the IRS. He thought that the moment he died, the IRS was going to descend on the house with helicopters, scoop up the journals and say, these are worth millions. The tax on them will be, $700,000, which of course we didn't have. So, in many, many ways, I think he began to understand the value of the journals and to want them published. But as you say, certainly with some ambivalence.
Yeah.
Well, we should probably explain that the published edition of the journal represents only about 5% of the entire manuscript journal.
That's another thing to be said about the journals. When we went to publish the journals, with, I hope, his complicity, they were edited by the brilliant Robert Gottlieb from this vast pile of documents down to this book. And in a way, the edit reflects Robert Gottlieb. And, the journals are incredibly funny. I mean, my father was the funniest man on earth. He really was funny. And often he was funny at your expense, which maybe made you not so happy about the fact that everyone else in the room was laughing at you. But he was tremendously funny, also at his own expense. And there's a lot of that in the journals, a lot of it. And that just didn't make it into the book. So I hope that someday the entire journal will get published, or at least a representative. In fact, Knopf is supposed to publish it in paperback, but,
Library of America.
Now, I have another question, but about the journals. One of the most heart-stopping moments in the biography is when he would occasionally just open up a page of the journals he'd just written the night before and just hand it to somebody and wait for their reaction, which surprised me so much and shocked me. But
I didn't quite hear that last part, that he dealt almost solely with the surface.
There was another quote from Home Before Dark. I'm sorry. My father's intense concentration on what you can see and hear and touch and smell was at the core of his gift as a writer. He focused on the surface and texture of life, not on the emotions and motives underneath.
I think, let me answer the cosmic part of the question first. Home Before Dark was written under very weird circumstances. I started writing it when it was clear that he was going to die, after he got diagnosed, and I was supposed to be writing another book, a big novel. And I just thought, what if his stories are lost? Because as I said, he was very funny. He was always telling funny stories. And I thought, I'll just write down all his funny stories. And then I'll stop and go back to my novel. And, it just every morning I would get up and think I should go back to the novel, and instead I would go, but what about the story about Harmon the cat, or whatever it was? And so without knowing what I was doing, I started writing a book. And then when I read the journals, I stopped writing the book because I thought, I am not going to touch this. In other words, my intention was to eulogize him. And actually, let me say, this story that I'm telling now is perfectly presented in the biography for the first time. Anyway, then I had lunch with a Cheever scholar who told me that he was going to write a biography in which he was going to reveal all this stuff. And then someone else. So I became aware that other people were writing about him in an attempt, or partly in an attempt, to sensationalize his sexuality. And I thought, okay, I'm going to write Home Before Dark to protect him. So I wrote it as a eulogy. I wrote it very fast. And it stands up amazingly well to me. But I think what I meant is not that he didn't, know what the depths were. It was that he represented them so brilliantly in the surfaces. I mean, sort of what we've been saying all night. And I kind of left the work out. I mean, one of Blake's great accomplishments is to write a biography of a man and brilliant critical essays about the work, and to weave them together. I just didn't really write about the work. I just wrote about the man. And Home Before Dark is a very short, sweet book. And I think it did what I intended it to do.
I think we have to end there. Thank you to our panelists very much, and thank you all for coming.